I still remember the first time I hopped on a sales call with someone who had found me through my podcast. As soon as the call started, she told me she was fangirling and was so excited to discuss working with me because she knew just from my podcast that she wanted to hire me. That was honestly one of the best feelings ever, and that feeling never gets old. Each sales call I've done or DM conversation I've had with someone who found me through my podcast is always the same. They tell me that they knew from my podcast that they wanted to work with me. And 9 times out of 10, they will quote back to me something I said in my podcast or say, "Yes, I remember you saying that in your podcast episode." That's the power of podcasting. It really can make sales calls an easy yes. And that's exactly what I'm talking about today. Welcome back to Evergreen Marketing Era for Women Entrepreneurs. I'm your host, Andrea Singletary, podcast strategist for women in business who want to consistently attract quality leads through podcasting. So, there are 3 things you need to do with your podcast to make sales calls an easy yes. Be authentic, build authority and trust, and create the content your ideal listeners want and need. I recently had one of my Evergreen Marketing Accelerator clients share with me that taking this approach has made it so that every sales call she's had with someone who has found her through her podcast has made them say that they already knew they wanted to work with her. Podcasting can build trust and build trust quickly. I've seen this time and time again. And even me as a podcast consumer, there have been many times that I have worked with someone just from their podcast. I didn't go look at their social media content. Sometimes I didn't even go to their website. I just clicked the link in their bio, or I would shoot them a quick DM like, "Hey, I'm thinking about joining this offer. Is this right for my situation?" Like, there's just something about tuning into a podcast episode and hearing someone's voice and feeling so connected to them, but also feeling like they see you, like they get it. They're saying the very thing that you're thinking and feeling, and like, oh my gosh, they're in my head. But also, you get a taste of their personality and how they are and everything. And it's just that trust is built so quickly. But let's get back to the point. I'm going to break down those 3 things that your podcast needs to make sales calls an easy yes. So 1, you have to be authentic. When I talk about being authentic, I'm talking about being the real you. Not what you think people want and not what you think people need to hear. So if you're quirky, be quirky. If you're silly, be silly. Like, one of the things that when it comes to podcasting is that you should never hide your personality. I know for me, I have very dry humor. I love making 90s references, especially 90s hip hop and R&B. I actually have an email going out tomorrow where I'm referencing the song The First of the Month by Bone Thugs and Harmony. If I ever one little word, one little sentence, one little phrase in my email makes me think of a 90s song, I will include it in the email. And I do this with my podcast too. There's just something about just being yourself behind this microphone, not trying to hide anything, not trying to show up or come off as a certain way. Now, when I first started my podcast, I really listening to those episodes make me cringe because they're so polished and perfected, and I try to come off a certain way. And I'm not going to lie, I feel like I didn't truly showcase my personality in those first episodes. I'm going to say probably those first 50 plus episodes. But I mean, I still sign clients from those episodes, and I still have people go back and listen to those episodes and they absolutely love them. But what I'm getting at is that be the real you, be the person that they're actually going to get when they hire you. And I know I say that a lot, but the reason why is that you don't want someone to hire you and they're thinking they're getting one person, but then when they actually work with you, you're completely different. That is a turnoff. That is such a like, what? And so you really want to show up as the real you. Now, I'm not saying act unprofessional or different things like that, but just be like who you are. Like, how do you actually interact with your clients? How do you talk to your clients? You know, and you want to bring that to your podcast content. Again, you don't have to be prim and proper, perfectly polished. If that's not how you are in everyday life, if that is not how you are when you're interacting with your clients, you want to just make sure that your personality is really reflected in your content and just showing up as who you really are. The second thing is build authority and trust. This is really going to boil down to the type of content you create. So there are a few content categories that you need to create content for to build that authority and trust. As thought leadership content, relatable content, sharing your values and beliefs, and content that demonstrates your expertise. And when I say content that demonstrates your expertise, I'm talking about content that really shows your people that you are that girl. Like, yes, this is my expertise. I know my stuff. This is what's happening. This is how I handle things. This is really important. Like, you really need to be creating the right type of content. And you really need to be creating content that, one, demonstrates like you know what you're talking about. You support your clients in getting these types of results. You're not just talking out the side of your neck. Like, you know your stuff. But also, you want to create content that shows that people can actually relate to you, that you actually get it. I feel like this is really important because there's a lot of mean girl energy in a lot of the content that's put out there, and it's very off-putting. And nobody wants to really work with someone who is giving off mean girl energy vibes. It really helps to show people like, hey, I've been there and I get it. I understand how you're feeling. So like creating content that kind of shows that empathy, but also, especially in this political climate, making it clear what you stand for. So like, for instance, with me, like even like on my threads and, I've done emails and stuff like that, I make it clear that I don't align with this current administration, I should say. Especially like people know I'm a follower of Jesus Christ. And I don't believe Jesus would be cool with any of this. So I make that clear. I don't support ICE. I don't support any of these things because it's not Christ-like. It's not showing love. Jesus came for the marginalized. He came for the poor. He came for the forgotten. He came for those people who are often mistreated. So yeah, he wouldn't be cool with this, and I'm not cool with it. Especially, I'm a Black woman too. Like, I've lived this my whole life. So, but this is what I'm talking about. Like, if you're on Threads, you've been seeing lots and lots of conversations and even people calling out other business owners and creators for not speaking up on these different things. Now, I'm not going to tell you how to go about doing this. I have a lot of thoughts on it, especially just from a lot of the things I've seen on Threads where people call themselves speaking up and they're not going about it the right way. But you do need to make it clear where you stand. And I'm not just talking about in reference to, like, again, our current political climate, but just on different issues and really showcasing your values and your beliefs because you want to deter the wrong people. You want to deter those people who you wouldn't align with, that you wouldn't realistically be able to support because you have such differing beliefs and it's going to impact, the work you guys are able to do. And I feel like this is very important and needs to be talked about more because if someone holds very strong beliefs to the point where it comes out in conversation and stuff like that, and you view things very differently from them, and it creates the situation where you're uncomfortable, well, yeah, they're not going to get the results that you promised. and it's not going to be a good experience. And that can lead to them, saying, oh, I wouldn't recommend working with her because X, Y, and Z. And so you do need to be sharing those beliefs and those values and whatnot. I'm not saying it needs to take over all your content, but I should be able to know your stance on certain things or how you approach certain things, even certain methods you use and whatnot. So that way I can make an informed decision about whether or not I'm a good fit for working with you, but also so you can make it clear to me like, hey, you're not a good fit, or yeah, you would be perfect. So this is why, like I say, you need to incorporate that type of content. And it's really good to do on your podcast, because podcasts, and I've seen this time and time again, the trust factor that is built really quickly. There's just something about consuming content in this format where people just trust you a lot quicker. They feel connected to you. So you want to make sure you're making it clear, your values and beliefs, to make sure that those things are aligned before somebody hands over their money to you. One of the things I included in the Evergreen Marketing Accelerator are my podcast content planner. And so how I set the podcast content planner up, it's basically set up by each stage of the customer journey. And so within each stage of the customer journey, there are content pillars. And so there are some content pillars for thought leadership content, relatable content, sharing your values and beliefs, as well as, that content that really demonstrates your expertise and builds your authority and everything. And I did it this way because depending on what stage of the customer journey someone is at, the type of content they need is going to be different. But it really helps your listeners to see that you do know what you're talking about, but also give them a glimpse into who they will be working with if they hire you. And it helps them feel safe in investing with, in working with you. And I feel like this is something that is not talked about enough when it is like in the podcasting space, specifically podcasting for your business. People will tell you, create case study episodes or, talk about this, talk about that on your podcast. But it's so much deeper than that. We really have to look at our podcasts how we do all marketing. People create funnels on different platforms. They create email funnels. They create funnels with use Instagram for their top of funnel or Threads for their top of funnel, and then moving people over to the email list where they nurture them, and it's over here. But you can do all three with your podcasts. But in order for that to work, you need to be creating content for each stage of the customer journey. And even within each stage of the customer journey, there's certain content pillars that you need to be creating content around. So that way you're speaking to the different buyer types and you're, addressing those different things that speaks to different buyers. So, okay, I know I kind of went on a little bit of a tangent there, but there's a method to my madness, I promise you. Okay, so the last thing that you need to make sure you're doing is creating content that your ideal listeners want and need. Now, this kind of connects to a bit about what I said about, the content you're creating around building authority and trust. But this is really important. You can't just talk about what you want to talk about or what you think is relevant. Your podcast content needs to be about your ideal listener. And when I say ideal listener, I'm referring to the person who will actually be a good fit for working with you and will invest in working with you. So I have a few, couple little guidelines for you to follow. One of the things is don't focus solely on educational content. Now, I'm not saying don't focus on educational content, especially how I teach it. When I refer to educational content, I'm referring to that content that asks your ideal buyers frequently asked questions. So that's my podcast resource library content. You do want to create that content. But if you're constantly educating people, you're going to attract DIYers. And that's not what we're trying to do here. We're trying to attract the people who want you to either do it for them or support you through implementation. So you're done with you people. That's what we want. And so for those people, they need more than just that educational or podcast resource library content. That podcast resource library content, that's your top of funnel content. So we don't want to keep them there. We got to move them down our funnel. So this is where you start discussing more nuanced topics, things that shift their mindset and perspective, topics that will make them pause and think because they didn't know that or haven't thought about that before. Sharing more behind the scenes of implementation. So whether that's you implementing it or, you supporting a client implementing it. But we want to dive deeper into these other topics. And even those topics too, where you address their objections before they ever express that objection. Really just like looking at your content differently. And one of the things I really like about the more nuanced topics is because you're speaking to specific situations, right? Or speaking to more like unique situations, especially like if you know your ideal buyer really well, and there's certain things that they're experiencing that someone at their level would not experience. So you speaking directly to them, it's like telling them like, I see you. I know where you're at. I know what your challenges are. And so this is why you're experiencing that challenge. And this is how my offer can support you with overcoming that challenge. Like you really have to approach it differently. And you really want to tap into those things that maybe you're not hearing a lot of people in your industry talk about. One of the things I don't see people in my industry often talk about is having your show notes housed on your website. And it really frustrates me that certain people in my industry, they refer to, so in your podcast hosting platform, when you go to schedule your episode, there's a little box where you can put in like your episode description, include any links and stuff. They refer to that as show notes. No, those are not show notes. In my book, in my definition, your show notes are what you house on your website. They're similar to a blog post. And I teach this because this is how you allow people to find you on Google, because your people aren't always searching the podcast listening apps. They may be typing in specific phrases or questions or keywords in Google. And when you use the right keywords and, follow a certain framework for your show notes can show up on the first page of Google. I've had plenty of my show notes show up on the first page of Google, and they weren't a full blog post. That's just kind of like an example of one of those more nuanced things where it's like, not a lot of people are talking about this, but also really helping you look at podcast visibility differently. Like we're not just optimizing for the podcast listening apps. We're optimizing for Google too, because we want more people to be able to find us. Okay, so enough of that. But these are the things that you need to be doing to make sales calls an easy yes through your podcast. Your podcast can do a lot of the heavy lifting for you. I have had clients sign on to work with me without ever hopping on a call with me. We maybe went back and forth in the DMs, but they just applied to work with me just from listening to my podcast. And so this is exactly what I teach you inside of the Evergreen Marketing Accelerator. I teach you these exact strategies so that your sales calls do become an easy yes for you. And one thing I always do when I connect with a potential lead is direct them to my podcast. This is so important because, again, I shared at the start of this episode, I think it was the start of this episode, or maybe it was another episode. I'm batching today, so please forgive me. But I think I shared in one of the other episodes that I know my podcast is my highest converting platform. And so for me, I'm going to direct people who are new to my world to my podcast because that has always worked in my favor. Just to give you an example, I once had someone get on a sales call with me before listening to my podcast. Didn't hear from her after the call. I sent the proposal and everything. I followed up, nothing. It was crickets. Well, a month later, she actually DM'd me saying that she had been binging my podcast And that she knew that out of all the people she got on a sales call with, I was the person she needed to hire because she knew I would give her the strategies that fit her season of life as a mom. That is the power of incorporating you in your podcast content. Because one of the things I do is I do talk about, me being a mom and lately talking about being a homeschooling mom, being, homeschooling mom who is also pregnant with her third child. I talk about these things because these are more nuanced things. Like, yes, it may not relate to everyone who listens to this podcast, but it relates to some of y'all. Or for those who may not be in that season, maybe they're thinking about it. I have a lot of women who listen to this podcast who aren't moms yet, but they're planning to become a mom in the future. And so giving them these insights, they're able to start shifting how they do things, and start rethinking things and shifting their perspective around things. So that's what I'm talking about, like these more nuanced topics and different things like that. Like, you need to bring you into your podcast because you'll either have people in your audience who are either in a similar season as you, or they're going to be there one day. And so you showing up, being that leader, demonstrating how you're navigating it, that builds trust because you've been there. You truly do get it because you're in the trenches or have been in the trenches. You're not just talking about what you've observed. Nah, you lived it. You've lived that life. And so this is why it's so important to bring this to your podcast. It really makes a world of a difference. And this is why I teach this in the accelerator, because I've seen it work for myself. I've seen it work for my clients. It's like literally the difference between those podcasts that convert and those that don't. Like, it really builds that trust quickly. So if that's something you want, if you want to be able to start making sales calls an easy yes through podcasting, or just make it so that like people already come to you knowing that they want to work with you just by binging your podcast, join us inside of the Evergreen Marketing Accelerator. You can apply now at mamatermompreneur.com/accelerator. This is linked below in the episode description and in the show notes. All right, I'll catch you in the next episode.